Welcome, everybody, to the second installment on the book of Job. We've already looked at chapters 1 and 2, and now we're going to spend time on chapter 3. This presentation will be in 3 parts. First of all, a reminder of chapters 1 and 2, setting the context for Job chapter 3. Then a careful reading of chapter 3, and we close with some reflections. Job chapters 1 and 2, the story has been set and, in a sense, set up. Basically, it was a traditional tale of the testing of a good man, but very carefully adjusted by the writer. In Job chapter 3, however, we leave behind the prose and the poetry starts, and this is where we begin to feel the power of the overall presentation. And we'll notice as we go on that there are different topics in the book of Job, and the book isn't always in agreement with itself. So, for example, in Job 1 and 2, the topics seem to be whether Job is holy because God minds him, or whether his devotion is quite as real as it looks. The second response of Job is a key. This time it says, very carefully, he did not sin with his lips. The first poem in the book of Job is on the lips of Job himself. And in some ways, the poem is foundational and it remains important throughout the book. The best way to approach this text is to take 4 steps. The first is to read it, just to feel the power of the poetry. And then we can begin to see where the energy lies in step 2 by looking at the parallelisms. I'll explain that in the next slide. And step 3 is to pay attention to the images, the metaphors being used. And step 4, to try to delineate the line of thought in chapter 3. And at the end of that, we should have a better idea of what chapter 3 is all about. For this stage, I'm going to combine reading chapter 3 and some observations about the poetry. As is commonly understood, in biblical poetry, there's a technique of saying the same thing twice. This is called parallelism. And initially, there are 2 kinds. There's synonymous parallelism, where more or less the very same thing is said. And there's antithetical parallelism, where it says kind of the opposite. You might get a positive and negative presentation. And the thing to look out for in biblical poetry is the second line is often more intense and more powerful. So we can see this straight away in verse 1. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day he was born. So we're told what he did with the opening of his mouth, and of course it's a big surprise after Job's so-called patience. Verse 2, Job spoke up and said. And then verse 3 is a good example of parallelism. Let the day on which I was born perish, and the night that said, a man has been conceived. And then in the following verses, sometimes we don't just have 2 lines, but sometimes 3 lines and 4 lines. That day let it be darkness, let not God on high regard it, nor let light shine on it. Let darkness and the deepest shadow claim it. Let a cloud settle on it. Let whatever blackens the day terrify it. That night let darkness seize it. So then we have 3 lines and then 4 lines actually. The second part of verse 6 is just 2 lines. Let it not be included among the days of the year. Let it not enter among the number of the months. And verse 7. Indeed, let that night be barren, let no shout of joy penetrate it. Not quite parallelism, really. Verse 8, let those who curse the day curse it, those who are prepared to arouse Leviathan. We'll see in the comment who Leviathan is. And verse 9 then has 3 lines in parallel. Let its morning stars be darkened. Let it wait for daylight but find none, nor let it see the first rays of dawn. So why? In verse 10, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb on me, nor did it hide trouble from my eyes. So in the second repetition there we see why he's suffering so much, because he actually got born. So the poem then continues, and we're still just noticing the way things are said twice and sometimes 3 times. So in verse 11, it really is 3 times. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not expire as I came out of the womb? Why were there knees to welcome me? And why were there 2 breasts that I might nurse at them? And then he reflects on it. That hadn't happened. For now I would be lying down and would be quiet. I would be asleep and then at peace. With kings and counsellors of the earth who built for themselves places now desolate, or with princes who possessed gold, who filled their palaces with silver. And then even more agonizingly, or why was I not buried like a stillborn infant, like infants who have never seen the light? And then he goes back to reflect on the peace of death. There the wicked cease from turmoil, there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners relax together, they don't hear the voice of the oppressor. Small and great are there, and the slave is free from his master. And finally we come to the closing lines, which is really devolves into questions. Why does God give light to one who is in misery, and life to those whose soul is bitter? To those who wait for death that does not come and search for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice even to jubilation and are exultant when they find the grave. Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden and whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes in place of my food, and my groanings flow out like water. The very thing I dreaded has happened to me, and what I fear has come upon me. I have no ease, I have no quietness, I cannot rest. Turmoil has come upon me. Having looked at the parallelism, which is present more or less throughout, it's time to go to a second level and just notice the metaphors. Dominant in the entire poem are the metaphors of birth and conception, the language of birth and conception, and the language of creation, but not positive, so that creation might be reversed. And this is so strong that he would like the day to be obliterated from the calendar. And then, using very severe language, he says not only did he wish that his mother was infertile, but that the night itself might be infertile. And then, because we're dealing with creation, we have that lovely language of the morning star, the dawn, and so on, which is normally positive, but here is negative. And in verse 10, we're back to the language of the womb, birth, and the language of Job's suffering. Job continues with the language of birth for a little bit in verses 11 and 12. So birth and immediately after birth. And then he goes to the opposite end of human experience, the repose of the grave. He wishes he were dead, because at least he'd be at peace, with powerful people, kings and counsellors and princes, who are all equally dead. And then he combines the language of birth and death by wishing he were a miscarriage, like a stillborn infant, like infants who never see the light. Very painful language. Then he goes back then to the grave and the peace of death, and he notes that people who are dead can no longer be oppressed, and that everybody is really equal in the grave. And the poem continues with rhetorical questions, asking God, and he notes an ironical quest for death, the exact opposite of what people should normally wish for, and finding it will lead to jubilation. And he thinks of God as an oppressor, and he notes his own psychosomatic symptoms, and he uses the language of food and water. So the basic diet of any human being is used here metaphorically. And then there's an intense understatement at the end. After all that terrible language, I have no ease, I have no quietness, I cannot rest, turmoil has come upon me. When we come to trace a line of thought in these verses, it's good to notice that there's an introduction, that's verses 1 and 2, and the complaint makes up the bulk of it, verses 3 to 26. And there are 24 lines of complaint, and they vary between 4 and 3 lines of verse each. And the sequence begins with the curse of the day. And then he continues to the curse of the night, but keeping in mind that in Hebrew counting, night comes before day, and so he's working in a sense backwards. And that leads to the complaint of why being born. And then he talks about his envy of the people who are in Sheol. At least they have a release of suffering, the dead. And he goes back then to a complaint, why is life given if this is what happens? And it concludes with an intense understatement of personal distress. So our next step is to have a very brief commentary on this very important part of the book of Job. In verses 1 and 2 we read, Now after this Job opened his mouth and cursed the day he was born. Job spoke up and said. So at last the 7-day silence is broken. And this time there is no pretense of devotion. And in some ways, 1b, he cursed the day he was born, is the whole poem. In verses 3 to 6, the desire that the day he was born should perish, and he wishes that there should be darkness on it. This is the book of Genesis, of course, but in reverse. The day is never to see that wonderful thing, the light. And he wishes that the blackness of the night would scare it off and overpower it. So much so he wants it taken out of the calendar. As we saw, Job wishes not only that his mother was barren, but that the night itself should be barren, a kind of poetic fallacy there. And he wishes that the shout of joy did not penetrate, or the normal shout of joy when a baby is born. And then he calls on people who curse the day, whoever they might be, people prepared to rouse up Leviathan. And Leviathan is the Middle Eastern symbol of chaos and destruction. And so to rouse up Leviathan is a very foolish thing. And when God replies to Job eventually at the end of the book, Leviathan gets mentioned again. And then Job brings up a very beautiful thing, the morning light, the morning stars, the first rays of the dawn. But he wishes all these to be reversed and cursed, because the doors of his mother's womb are not shut. He made his way out and then had a life of terrible trouble. In verses 11 and 12, he rehearses the stages of being born. That's to say, to be born, to expire as you come out of the womb, the knees and the breasts, and he regrets every stage of his birth and wishes none of it had ever happened. Has a moment of envy of the dead. If he hadn't been successfully born, but had died in the womb or died just afterwards, now he would be quiet, and this would be preferable for him. And he uses lovely words: quiet, asleep, and at peace, things he really wishes he could have back. And even great people of the past are now at peace, and powerful and rich people are now at peace. And if they can manage it, why not me? At this point in the poem, Job pulls up a terrible experience, a miscarriage, and uses that to talk about his own agony. This is a very difficult line. Why was I not buried like a stillborn infant? And then he goes back then to say the wicked, when they're dead, at least they have peace. And the prisoners can relax because he feels himself to be a prisoner and that God is his oppressor. And he says there's great equality there, and the slave is free from his master, and Job would be free from his God. Direct questions are now taken up about God. Why does God give life and light to people who suffer? That's a great question. And he measures the depth of their suffering. These are people who desire death, but it does not come, just like Job himself. And he says in a very contradictory way, they're exultant when they find the grave. So the joy that should attend a birth is transferred to death. And then he asks in the last verse, why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? You remember that Satan said to God, he's devoted to you because you've protected him, you've hedged him in, you're minding him. But the hedging in is also negative, as we see. Finally then, Job comes to rest with the language of his bodily agony, so sighing and groanings, and he uses then the language of food and drink, bread and water. He said, this is all I have to live on, is sighing and groaning. And then he regrets that the very thing he dreaded has happened to me. The very thing he dreaded when? Perhaps when he was so devoted about offering sacrifices for the sins that his children might have committed. And then in a very powerful understatement, he says, I have no ease. I have no quietness. I cannot rest. Turmoil has come upon me. An initial conclusion for today could be like this. When you compare chapters 1 and 2 and chapter 3, the question in chapter 3 is no longer protected devotion or exaggerated piety. Instead, the question comes up, what is God up to? What's God doing? And in a sense, it's no longer Job who's on trial. Rather, God is in the dock.